In this video, we're going to talk about how knights actually fought. Hollywood got medieval combat completely wrong. It was far more brutal, exhausting, and real than anything you've ever seen on screen. Forget the shiny swords and elegant duels. Real knights wrestled in mud, used every dirty tactic they could, and showed no mercy to fallen foes. By the end of this video, you'll never look at movie sword fights the same way again. Hollywood has sold us a beautiful lie. Gleaming blades dancing through the air, knights dueling with theatrical grace, combat that flows like choreographed ballet. It's captivating cinema, and it's completely wrong. The truth about medieval warfare is far more brutal, exhausting, and unglamorous than any film has dared to show. Real armored combat wasn't decided by who had the flashiest swordwork. It was won by whoever could keep fighting when their body screamed to stop, who understood leverage better than their opponent, and who was willing to wrestle in the dirt until they could drive a blade through a gap in someone's armor. Strip away Hollywood's fantasy, and you discover that knights spent most battles wielding weapons you've never heard of, using techniques that would get them instantly killed in a movie fight scene. The dagger, where battles actually ended. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth that cinema consistently avoids. The weapon that actually killed most armored knights, not the sword. Not some dramatic blade-to-blade exchange, the rondel dagger. This unglamorous 12 to 15-inch blade with its narrow, rigid profile existed for one specific purpose: finishing fights against armored opponents who'd gone down. Picture yourself standing over a downed knight. He's struggling beneath you, metal scraping against stone or mud, both of you gasping for air inside your helmets. This is where the real killing happens. First, you control his arms while he's desperately trying to reach his own dagger or throw you off. Then comes the systematic search for vulnerability. You probe the visor slit, test the armpit gap, check where his helmet joins the gorget protecting his throat. Once you've found your opening, you press the dagger in and apply your full body weight. You feel the blade grinding past metal, through mail if it's present, into flesh beneath. The sounds aren't what movies have taught you to expect. No orchestral swells, no clean deaths accompanied by noble final words. Just labored breathing echoing inside steel helmets. The scraping of metal on metal as you probe for gaps, perhaps screaming if your strike penetrates but fails to kill immediately. Medieval manuals called this technique the mercy. Not because it showed compassion, but because dagger work ended fights that could otherwise continue indefinitely between well-protected opponents. Tournament rules specifically prohibited this technique. Real warfare had no such restrictions. Watch any actual medieval battle, and you'd realize most knightly deaths occurred exactly this way. Not from spectacular strikes during the heat of combat, but from daggers applied methodically after one fighter was pinned. The clash of weapons might rage for minutes. The dagger work that followed determined who walked away. Daggers didn't win fights. They finished them in the most brutal, unglamorous fashion imaginable. Wrestling. The forgotten art of armored combat. Here's something else Hollywood never depicts: knights wrestling. Not occasionally grappling when disarmed, but spending enormous portions of combat time locked in strength contests that bore zero resemblance to elegant swordplay. When both combatants wore effective armor, wrestling often became the only method of creating opportunities to kill. Imagine closing with your opponent, your weapon strikes bouncing ineffectively off his plate armor. One of you seizes the other hand clamping on arm, gripping weapon shaft, clutching at helmet. Now the genuine fight begins. A brutal contest of strength, leverage, and balance that resembles a wrestling match far more than cinematic sword combat. Stand in the midst of armored grappling, and you'd feel both suits of armor working against you. You attempt to throw your opponent, he braces and pushes back. Both of you strain with maximum effort, breathing raggedly inside confined helmets. Feet scraping desperately for purchase in mud or on stone. Armor clanks with every shift in position. Metal grinds against metal. The techniques were methodical and specific. Hook your opponent's leg with yours while simultaneously shoving his upper body backward. Grab his weapon arm and twist violently while hammering with your free hand. Maneuver behind him and yank backward at the gorget, either choking him or exposing his neck to your dagger. You'd hear grunts of extreme effort echoing within helmets. Feel your muscles burning as you struggled to out-leverage an opponent encased in 50 pounds of steel. Every position had specific counters. Every throwing technique had defensive responses. Combat would decelerate into grinding tests of strength lasting multiple minutes, both fighters too heavily armored to injure each other through strikes, too evenly matched to easily force the other down. When one combatant finally achieved dominant position, mounted atop a downed opponent, that's when daggers emerged from sheaths. But reaching that position required wrestling expertise that knights spent years developing. Once armor rendered conventional weapons ineffective, knights became grapplers first and swordsmen second. Victory went to whoever could throw the other man first and maintain control long enough to apply the killing blade. The mace and warhammer. Crushing what cannot be cut. Watch a knight approaching with a mace, and you'd understand immediately that your armor wouldn't save you. Because maces didn't require penetration, they crushed whatever lay underneath the steel. A military mace was elegantly simple, a metal shaft approximately 2 to 3 feet long topped with a flanged or spiked head weighing 2 to 3 pounds. Those flanges concentrated tremendous force into minimal surface area, denting armor inward. Strike someone's helmet with sufficient force, and penetration became irrelevant. The brain inside would impact the skull, causing concussion, unconsciousness, or death. Stand on the receiving end of a mace blow and you'd feel the impact reverberate through your entire body. The strike would ring your helmet like a cathedral bell. Vision would blur instantly. Balance would fail. Even if your armor held structurally perfect, you'd be stunned, disoriented, catastrophically vulnerable to follow-up strikes that you could no longer effectively defend against. Warhammers operated on identical principles with slightly different mechanics. A crushing hammerhead on one face, a punching spike on the reverse, mounted on a 2 to 3 foot shaft. Against plate armor, you'd alternate systematically, deploy the hammer to dent armor and stun your opponent, then flip the weapon and use the spike to exploit the deformed metal, potentially punching through. The technique wasn't sophisticated, which precisely explained these weapons' effectiveness. You didn't need a decade of training to wield a mace competently. You needed raw strength and decent timing. Swing forcefully at the head or limbs. When your opponent raised his guard defensively, redirect to the body. Keep him reacting rather than acting. Keep him accumulating damage, dents in armor, impacts to the brain, bruises beneath the steel, until he physically couldn't continue fighting. You'd hear mace combat before seeing it. The metallic clang of weapons hammering armor, grunts of maximum effort, breathing growing progressively heavier as fighters accumulated fatigue. Exhaustion arrived faster with maces than swords. Each swing demanded full-body commitment. After several minutes, your arms would burn with lactic acid accumulation. Maces transformed armored combat into pure endurance contests. The last man standing was simply the one who could keep swinging when everyone else had collapsed from exhaustion. The poleaxe. The weapon knights actually chose. When knights fought dismounted and could select their own weapons for serious combat, they overwhelmingly chose poleaxes, not swords despite what every movie suggests. The poleaxe solved every problem that armored combat presented. Reach, leverage, versatility, and armor-defeating capability, all integrated into one 5 to 6 foot package. Stand holding a poleaxe, and you'd grasp its genius immediately. One end featured an axe blade for chopping and hooking. The opposite end had a hammer for crushing impacts. The top bore a spike for thrusting attacks. The entire shaft served as a lever for hooking, tripping, and controlling opponents. 4 weapons merged into one, weighing 7 to 10 pounds, perfectly balanced for extended use. Watch experienced knights wielding poleaxes, and you'd realize how catastrophically wrong movies portrayed medieval combat. No wild cinematic swinging. Every movement was controlled, economical, purposeful. They'd deploy the axe blade to hook an opponent's leg or weapon, use the hammerhead to strike helmets, not attempting penetration but aiming to disorient and knock opponents down. Use the spike to thrust at armor gaps when opportunities briefly appeared. The reach advantage was absolutely critical. Against a knight wielding a sword, you'd maintain distance with thrusting attacks, keeping him outside his effective range. He'd attempt to close, you'd use the hook to trip him or knock him backward. If he somehow got inside your optimal range, you'd simply choke up on the shaft, sliding your hands upward to fight effectively at close quarters. The poleaxe remained devastatingly effective at any distance. The versatility created constant uncertainty. That approaching strike, would it be a thrust you needed to parry, a hook requiring you to dodge, or a hammer blow you'd have to absorb? Decision time measured in fractions of seconds, and choosing incorrectly meant going down hard. Tournament combat favored poleaxes overwhelmingly. Knights who trained extensively with swords would switch to poleaxes when facing other armored opponents, because the poleaxe simply worked better against quality armor. When knights chose their own weapons for fights where their lives were genuinely at stake, they chose poleaxes. Swords were backup weapons, what you grabbed when you didn't have superior options available. The sword. A tool of last resort. You'd draw your sword only after everything else had failed catastrophically. After your lance shattered on impact, after you'd been unhorsed, when you needed something versatile enough to exploit the minimal gaps in armor. The arming sword, the most common knightly sword, weighed 2 to 4 pounds with a blade approximately 30 inches long. Not the thin, elegant rapier Hollywood favors. This was a broad, double-edged blade engineered to cut and thrust against armored opponents who wouldn't go down easily. Stand in actual combat wielding a sword, and you discover how rapidly your arm fatigued. Each swing required significant effort. Each parry jarred your wrist painfully. Within minutes, your sword arm would be screaming in protest. Within 10 minutes, you'd be swinging at half your initial speed. That's why authentic medieval combat was brief. Human endurance has biological limits that movies consistently ignore. The techniques bore no resemblance to movies whatsoever. You wouldn't fence gracefully, exchanging elegant strikes. You'd employ half-swording, gripping the blade with your offhand to control it like a short spear, thrusting at armor gaps with precision, or murder strokes, flipping the sword entirely to grip the blade and using the heavy pommel and crossguard as an improvised hammer to bash helmets and visors. Against armored opponents, you'd rarely swing at all. Cutting strokes bounced harmlessly off quality plate armor. Instead, you'd probe systematically for weaknesses. Armpits, elbow joints, visor slits, the gap where helmet met gorget. Every strike was targeted at specific vulnerability points requiring precision rather than force. Stamina management became absolutely critical. You'd observe experienced knights fighting in explosive bursts, aggressive exchanges lasting 10 to 15 seconds, then both combatants stepping back to breathe heavily and reassess. Novices exhausted themselves in the first minute and died when they could no longer raise their guards defensively. Swords were tools of necessity, not preference. Using one meant the battle had already gone wrong. The lance. Spectacular but single use. Stand in a cavalry formation preparing to charge, and you'd feel the lance's oppressive weight immediately. 12 feet of solid wood tipped with steel, heavy enough that holding it horizontal made your arm burn within seconds. This wasn't a graceful, refined weapon. It was a battering ram you aimed from horseback at tremendous velocity. The physics were absolutely devastating. A knight in full armor weighed perhaps 200 pounds. His warhorse weighed 1,200 to 500 pounds. Charging at 20 to 25 miles per hour, the combined kinetic energy was enormous. The lance focused all that force into a few square inches of sharpened steel. You'd see the charge approaching, hear the thunder of hooves shaking the earth, watch dozens of lance tips lowering in unison like some terrible forest of steel. Then impact, lances punching through shields, through mail, through bodies, men lifted entirely off their feet, knights thrown from saddles as lances shattered or embedded in targets. The skill wasn't in the strike itself, it was in staying mounted. You'd grip the lance loosely, allowing impact energy to travel through the weapon rather than transferring into your arm. Grip too tightly, and the force would dislocate your shoulder or unhorse you violently. But here's what movies never shows honestly. Lances broke, almost invariably. One solid hit, and the shaft would splinter into pieces. Then you drop the fragments and pull your backup weapon, poleaxe or mace, for the real fighting that followed. The lance charge was spectacular theater, but it was merely the opening move. The lance was a single-shot terror weapon that won battles in the seconds before actual sustained combat began. The exhausting truth. Movie nights fight for hours without visible fatigue, fence elegantly with swords that never grow heavy, and die from single dramatic strikes accompanied by orchestral music. Stand in real knightly combat and you'd discover none of that reflected reality. Believing Hollywood's version could get you killed within minutes. Films show swords as primary weapons. Real knights used lances for cavalry charges, poleaxes for dismounted fighting, and swords only as backup options of last resort. The weapons that actually decided battles were precisely the ones movies ignore entirely. Movies depict graceful fencing. Real combat was brutal, exhausting grappling and weapon strikes aimed at breaking bones through armor or exploiting the few vulnerable gaps. The techniques looked clumsy because they had to function within armor's severe mobility restrictions. Cinema heroes fight indefinitely without consequence. Real knights had perhaps 15 to 20 minutes of effective combat capability before exhaustion became life-threatening. The weight of armor, the effort required for every movement, the heat trapped inside metal shells, all combined to make sustained combat physically impossible. Battles were won by whoever could maintain intensity longest, not by superior swordsmanship. Everyone used to see dramatic sword strikes as killing blows. Reality was daggers pressed methodically into gaps while one man held another down, both gasping for breath, both exhausted beyond measure. That's how armored knights actually died, not in glorious combat, but in desperate grappling on the ground. Modern psychology, shaped by TV and games, wouldn't prepare you for this reality. You think you understand violence from entertainment media. But the first time you felt the crushing exhaustion of fighting in 50 pounds of metal, heard your own ragged breathing echoing inside your helmet, felt your arms turning to wood after 3 minutes of striking, your understanding would shatter completely. The truth about knightly combat is deeply uncomfortable. The techniques weren't graceful arts. The victories weren't glorious triumphs worthy of songs. Medieval combat was brutal, exhausting, and concluded quickly because human bodies had biological limits that Hollywood refuses to acknowledge. Knights didn't fight like movies depict. They fought like exhausted men trapped in metal suits, desperately trying not to die, using whatever weapon functioned and whatever technique kept them breathing longest. That's the reality cinema won't show you, because the truth doesn't sell tickets.